pessimistic assessment of where the talks are now, that there's still a very wide gap between the two sides? And secondly, if the talks don't produce an agreement, there's a lot of speculation that Saudi Arabia would have to take steps of its own to develop a nuclear program to protect itself, to have its own deterrent. So those two questions. Do you similarly think that right now a deal is not in sight? And second, if one is found, would your personal view be that Saudi Arabia should have its own nuclear program?
Let me start by saying that the interim agreement is what it says it is. It is interim. So we have to wait until there is a final agreement before we can make a judgment on whether it is a good deal or a bad deal. The interim agreement has been welcomed, not only by Saudi Arabia, but all the Gulf states and generally most of the world community. But it's a step. It's not the final lap that is in view. And until the July deadline tells us where we're going from there, I don't think anybody should applaud at the moment what has been achieved. Saudi Arabia has always been in the Arab League position, which is that there should be a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And the view from Saudi Arabia is that this is the most equitable solution to a situation where the nuclear proliferation issue is really in front of our eyes. And whether it is Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, perhaps Iraq even, Turkey, or whatever. As I said before, Israel already possesses that weaponry that is nuclear. It's a weapon of mass destruction. There are chemical and biological weapons as well that we have to consider. We've just seen in Syria how the chemical issue became an important element in what is happening in Syria. So if you want to start from a level playing ground for such an important area as the Middle East, which has so many conflicts going on it, and you don't want to introduce a potential nuclear conflict or weapons of mass destruction conflict in it, go for the zone free of weapons of mass destruction. This was supported, by the way, by the NPT signatories in the review conference in 2010 in New York, where they agreed that there will be a conference set up in Finland in December 2012 to look at the issue of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction. The United States, the UK, the Russian Federation, and the United Nations were the, if you like, the sponsors or the custodians of this proposal, and they were supposed to work to make it happen. The Finnish government appointed a special representative that went around the world talking about the potential conference, etc. Unfortunately, in November, just a month before that conference was supposed to take place, the United States, saying that there was no grounds for agreement, simply pulled out of the conference and the whole thing collapsed. Now, Israel is not a member of the NPT. So how do you get Israel in? Well, I'm glad to say that post-collapse of that conference, through the IAEA, there have been smaller meetings, technical meetings, between members of the IAEA, and Israel participated, I think, in one or two of those meetings. Iran, unfortunately, attended one but skipped the other. So there is still a question mark where Iran stands on the issue of zone. And the irony here, and there's a big irony, is that in 1974, under the late Shah of Iran, it was Iran that introduced the idea at that time of a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. And publicly, at least, Iran still says that it is committed to the zone. So what the kingdom wants to see is that zone being put in place. I have put a paper out on this issue which says that in order for the zone to be established, it needs 2 guarantees from the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The first guarantee is that the countries of the zone will get a nuclear security umbrella so that they don't feel threatened by not developing their own weapons of mass destruction from any source. But it has to be the 5 permanent members who guarantee that. And the second guarantee is that these 5 permanent members will sanction any breaker of the conditions of the zone, not only by economic and political sanctions, but also by military means. Without these 2 guarantees, the zone is not going to work, because nobody is there to enforce it.
When you consider the alternative of a nuclear-armed Iran, that zone, although many regard it as impractical, certainly has benefits. I want to ask General Yadlin if he would just say a few words about Iran. In your job as head of Israeli military intelligence, Iran was a constant preoccupation for you, as it is for the current Israeli government. I traveled to Iran in December of last year, and to my dismay, I found no evidence of a country that really was prepared to turn the corner away from the kind of revolutionary challenge, not just to Israel, but to Saudi Arabia. Your Highness, you should have heard the things the Iranians said to me about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So
Why do you want to inflict that on me?
So I want to ask General Yadlin about the dangers that lie ahead. One of our mutual friends, Graham Allison, used to say that the Iran nuclear crisis is the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. And these negotiations have put us in a different frame of mind where we've been thinking about a negotiated settlement. But do you think this is still the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion, that we're heading toward conflict down the road because of inability to make a deal?
I think it's a different form. With all due respect to Professor Ellison, which is my teacher and my professor, it's a different issue. It's a different issue. Iran is a danger because Iran calling to the annihilation of the state of Israel, the destruction of the state of Israel, for wiping it off the map, erasing it off the map. And this is a reason to be very worried. There are many others who want to do it, but may be unable, according to Prince Turki judgment. If this very radical regime will marry a very radical weapon for a people that went through a mass killing 70 years ago in a war that we were not involved in, based on hate crimes that we saw here in this city on Saturday. We have to be very worried, and to make everything that Iran will not possess a nuclear weapons. I don't remember the Soviet Union want to destroy the United States of America and vice versa. They have a different ideologies. Each of them wanted to have hegemony politically, ideologically in the world, but annihilation was not the target. When a country like Iran going in this path publicly and in every effort that they can do without nuclear weapons, because Iran is the source of instability, of terror, of civil war in the Middle East. Who is helping Assad to survive? The Iranians. The Iranians proxy, like Hezbollah. The Iranians are involved in Yemen, they are involved in Bahrain, they are already controlling this way or another Iraq, And if they will have a nuclear weapons, I think some of their neighbors have to worry a lot about it beside Israel. So the goal of my government is to do everything that Iran will not hold a nuclear weapon. And once again, Israel is for a Middle East free of nuclear weapons. However, this should be started when all the countries in the region will recognize each other, will stop saying that they want to destroy each other. And once again, it's not the hen and the egg here. Don't put the horses before the carriage. Because in a region, when Iraq tried to reach a nuclear weapons, even though they signed the NPT, when Libya did the same, when Assad bought a nuclear reactor from North Korea, you have to be very careful, very careful. So first, build trust in the region, build peace in the region, and immediately nobody will need to have a nuclear weapon.
Let me just say
Please.
here on this issue of signing the NPT. Not signing the NPT should not be a license to develop nuclear weapons. And that is what Israel has done. So building trust is mutual. It's not one-sided. And I'd urge Israel to take that proposition seriously when we think of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction. As I said, those two guarantees are important to make the zone work. The zone is not going to be implemented the next day that it is declared. There's going to be a period of negotiations to bring, no matter how many countries, from let's say Iran all the way to the Atlantic, you've got 25, 26 countries, maybe more, to be included in that. So there should be a period of setting up the zone, during which, hopefully, the negotiations between Israel and the Arab world will reach a settlement, and on whatever conditions are there, hopefully through the Arab Peace Initiative. And once you have that settlement between Israel and the Arab world, you have it with the rest of the Islamic world, because the OIC countries, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, has declared their support for the Arab Peace Initiative. And that includes Iran, although Iran has equivocated on the issue of...
And you trust the Iranians, right?
No, it's not a matter of trust, and this is why you need those guarantees, General, from the 5 permanent members, that you can sanction anybody who will infringe on the conditions of the zone. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, is that the internal situation in Iran is in such flux. Who do you talk to in Iran? Basically, and I think this is a problem not just for Saudi Arabia and Iran's neighbors, but for the world community, even for the 5+1 now. They're talking to Zarif and Rouhani. But it is really Khamenei who's making the decisions. And maybe at the moment Rouhani has the good ear of Khamenei, but you don't know when that ear is going to turn deaf to him. So there is a struggle going on inside Iran. Last week, Rouhani made a speech, I think to a group of either students or other members of academic community in Iran. And he practically said, as the general was saying earlier, that Iran's economic situation today is so poor that there is a danger that, as he called it, the Islamic Republic will collapse. These were Rouhani's words, not mine or anybody else.
This is why, as a recent visitor, I can tell you this is why he got elected. He also said one other important thing last week, which was that he supported Iranians' right to be happy. I don't know if you
Isn't that amazing?
followed that the president of Iran has to send out a Twitter message saying it's okay to be happy.
And he's the only one who can use the Twitter, by the way.
Yes.
Not-
I want to leave a little bit of time for our audience to question these two
We
distinguished
haven't talked about Syria yet.
gentlemen. But that's so. I want to turn to Syria before we turn over the floor, and I want to ask each of you to speak about this terrible situation.
Thank you.
That is on each of your
Would
borders.
you like some?
I'm going to say no, but I'm going to salute the gesture by General Yadlin. If we can drink water together, what isn't possible?
You should salute me for taking it from there.
I salute both.
Thank you.
But let's talk sadly about the situation in Syria. It's on both of your borders.
Yes.
It is a tragedy beyond describing. The number of people that have been killed, the complete breakdown of institutions of government, the destruction of these great cities. I'd like to ask each of you if you think that the best way forward is something that I think President Obama may speak to the United States about tomorrow night, which is some greater program of training and assistance for the moderate Syrian rebels as a way to both go after extremists in Syria and also as a way to fight the regime of President Bashar al-Assad. Let me begin with you, Prince Turki.
Sure.
Do you think that Saudi Arabia has long privately advocated more of that kind of approach of training and arming the rebels, and indeed has urged, I think, that they be given shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles? Are you confident that that's the right way forward here? And how is this war? We're talking about a war that will last years before it's resolved?
Let me begin by saying that at the very beginning of the demonstrations and the growing opposition to the government in Syria, King Abdullah tried 3 or 4 times, not only to talk to Assad himself about meeting some of the demands of these demonstrators and not use the lethal methods that he has used since then, sent emissaries and so on, unfortunately without much success. So the kingdom turned towards the international organizations. First in the Arab League, as you know, the kingdom and the other Gulf states were promoted the idea of an interim government that would bring the opposition and the representative of the present government, not Assad, but they even suggested that his vice president be involved in this interim government. Unfortunately, he hasn't been heard of since then. But anyway, that proposal passed through the Arab League, was taken to the United Nations Security Council by the Arab League, where unfortunately it was vetoed by the Russians and the Chinese. Like, when was it, yesterday or the day before, again, the issue of the International Criminal Court being given the permission to investigate cases of crimes against humanity or other such dire things that are happening in Syria was also vetoed by the Russians and the Chinese. That is the unfortunate thing. On the other side, of course, whether it is Europe or the United States, from March 2011 until today, the kingdom was always urging that the opposition must be given the means to defend the Syrian people against this lethal armory that Assad can deploy. He has MiG aircraft, he has helicopters, he has missiles, he has tanks, he has artillery, all of the advantages of a war machine that for years Assad claimed he was building in order to meet the Israeli challenge on the Golan Heights and others, but now he has turned them against his people, and his people don't have the means to defend themselves. You've seen pictures of these so-called fire barrels being lobbed from helicopters on bread lines. Children and women and people buying bread in Hama or Homs or Aleppo or anywhere are being killed by these firebombs. And yet the West in general has refrained from providing that kind of assistance to the opposition. And what happens when you have a festering wound like Syria is today? Inevitably, it collects all of the bad bacteria that you can imagine. And that's where things like Daesh and
Daesh
Jabhat
is
al-Nusra,
the group even more extremist than Al-Qaeda.
all of the worst elements are now in Syria. Not just from the Sunni side, but even from the so-called Shia side. Hezbollah, of course, has been pushed by the Iranians to fight in Syria. But even militias from Iraq that are supported by Iran are also pushed into Syria. Volunteers from Afghanistan, from Saudi Arabia, from the United States, from Europe. Belgium is worried about how many Belgians are now volunteering to fight on either side of the conflict there. So unless you clean the wound and suture it, it's going to continue to collect all of these bad bacteria. And what Saudi Arabia has asked is not to send troops to Syria. That has never been a proposition that was put before Saudi Arabia's friends, whether in Europe or in the United States, but simply to provide the necessary means to defend against the aircraft and against the other advanced weaponry that Assad deploys against his own people. So far, no one has come with any of those aids to the Syrian opposition. And that's why you have the irony now is that the legitimate and genuine and moderate opposition to Assad is fighting on both fronts. They're fighting against the Syrian government and they're fighting against these extremist hooligans and criminals that are so devastating in their outlook, not just to Assad, but to the people of Syria.
General Yadlin, I'd be very interested in your sense of